coming up first to the stage is our moderator. Please welcome Morgan Menzies, also known as Pretty Little Bookshelf on Instagram. She is an avid reader and community builder focused on empowering readers to diversify their bookshelves. She passionately fosters literary discussions with readers. Up next, an award-winning author who just penned The Queen of Sugar Hill, a novel of Hattie McDaniel, written 53 books and has been seen on NBC's The Today Show, Rashonda Tate. Up next, a New York Times best-selling author of 5 novels, including the recent book club pick, The House of Eve, named by Oprah Magazine as 27 of 2021 most anticipated winter historical fiction book, Sadiqa Johnson. And lastly, an author who has over 3 million books in print. Her work, 7 Deadly Sins, Lust, Envy, Greed, and Wrath, has been featured on the Lifetime Movie Network, Victoria Christopher Murray.
Hello. Okay, so before we get started, can we give some more love for these ladies? All right, so welcome to the She Did That Celebrating Her Story panel. I am so excited to discuss historical fiction with you all. In each of your novels, you provide the reader a window into the past, and you provide us with context and depth that is sometimes history that we're unaware of, or in some of the cases, it's Black women's stories who we are not aware of. And so with each of your novels, you're able to tell us about these women in a way that emphasizes that our experiences are not singular. And so just starting with each of you, can you give us a brief synopsis of your novels and explain why it was important for you to talk about your main character?
So my novel is about Hattie McDaniel, and I initially did not like Hattie McDaniel because my grandmother was a fan of Gone with the Wind, and the first time I saw it, I just did not like it. My grandmother said, "Why don't you like it?" And I said, "Well, she's playing this maid, and she's talking all stereotypical." And my grandmother said, "She's playing a maid, but I am a maid. And so why are you looking at her with disdain?" And then she said, "Plus, this movie took place in 1939. What did you expect her to play, Scarlett O'Hara?" And it was at that point that I started seeing Hattie McDaniel in a different light. And so I realized once we took off our 21st century lenses, then this was a woman to be reckoned with. And the more I researched, I was dumbfounded at all that we did not know. And one of the biggest and most important is we can live anywhere we want to live because of Hattie McDaniel and her efforts. And I'm like, how did we not know that? And how can I help the world know that? And so that's how her story was born, and I have just loved traveling all over, telling her story that was full of drama. I didn't need to create any drama because she had a whole bunch of it, but just getting people to take off that lens and see her in a new light.
And Sadiqa?
Okay, so I'm Sadiqa Johnson. I am the author of The House of Eve. And The House of Eve came to me because I was thinking about stories that my grandmother also told me. My grandmother told me that she was the black sheep of our family. She got pregnant with my mom at age 14. It was the early 1950s. And as we know, good girls didn't do that outside of marriage. And it was such a source of shame for her that they kept the secret from everyone. So my mom tells me that she didn't know my grandmother was her mother until she was in the 3rd grade. And I started thinking about women and secrets and reproductive issues and what type of options my grandmother had when she found herself pregnant in the 1950s. And this thought led me to the discovery of maternity homes, and it was something that I always feel like women's history is something we don't learn about in school. And I feel that my job as a historical fiction writer is to shine a light in these dark spaces and bring our stories to life. And so that was what I tried to do with The House of Eve, and that was the beginning of that little nugget in my head that started the story.
And I'm Victoria Christopher Murray, and my novel, The First Ladies, is about someone you know, Eleanor Roosevelt. But what you probably didn't know was that she became Eleanor Roosevelt because of a black woman, Mary McLeod Bethune. Eleanor Roosevelt did not come into her own until she met Mary McLeod Bethune, and they became best friends. And they became best friends during a time of Jim Crow and segregation, where black people and white people couldn't even shake hands in public. The very first public handshake was between Eleanor Roosevelt and Mary McLeod Bethune, and they planned it. And they were afraid they may have been arrested. And then those two women, during the time of FDR's administration, did so many things to change the world. So many things that we get to benefit from came from Mary McLeod Bethune and Eleanor Roosevelt's friendship together. And it's a shame that we don't know how they started the lynching bill. It's a shame that we don't know why so many black people vote Democrat versus Republican because of Mary McLeod Bethune.
Thank you. So to start off us, I know, Rashonda, you started talking a little bit about Hattie McDaniel, but can you tell us more about her as the first Oscar winner and also her role in redlining?
So, Hattie McDaniel played Mammy, for those that don't know, in Gone with the Wind. And she pushed through to be nominated because the producer of Gone with the Wind, David O. Selznick, had already nominated someone in Best Supporting Actress. And Hattie gathered all her sorority sisters who were members of Sigma Gamma Rho sorority. She gathered all the newspaper clippings, and she went into this man's office in 1939 and convinced him to nominate her. She won, but she was not allowed to attend the ceremony, the Academy Awards, because they had never had any African Americans. And so he pulled strings. He fought to get her there, and she was there, but she had to sit at the very, very back of the room by the wait staff in the kitchen, going into the kitchen. And so as I was writing the book, I would get angry because I'm like, she did all of this, and she's had to sit at the back of the room. And Hattie comes and talks to me, and she would come while I was writing. My mother said I need to stop telling people that because I sound crazy. But she would come, and she'd say, you're mad because I'm at the back of the room, but I'm in the room. And so it just caused me to shift my thinking. And that was her approach in everything. With redlining, she took it to the Supreme Court. She fought a case when her neighbors tried to sue her when she moved into her $1 million mansion. And they tried to sue her because there was a thing called restrictive covenants where black people could not buy homes in Los Angeles. And it really was, you're not supposed to sell to anyone who was not of pure European blood. So they sued, and Hattie McDaniel said, I worked too hard for my house, and she led the fight against restrictive covenants. They won, and that became the catalyst for the Supreme Court case that struck down restrictive covenants. And that basically says that now we can live wherever we want because they struck it down. And people didn't know that. We didn't know that Hattie McDaniel did anything other than win that Academy Award. And so that's part of telling her story.
Yes, and so another woman who was very politically involved, Mary McLeod Bethune. Victoria, can you talk about Mary's purpose? And throughout the novel, we see that she is driven, despite everything that is her external, she is laser focused on driving equity in healthcare, education, voting. So can you just tell us more about Mary?
You know what's so interesting about Mary McLeod Bethune? She was the 14th of 15 children born, the first one born free. She was the very first one in her family born free and raised on the plantation where her parents had been enslaved and her siblings had been enslaved. And at the age of 10, a white girl once told her that she could not read her book. And Mary was only 10, thinking, well, if I can't read, there must be something in that book. I need to figure this out. She told her parents she wanted to go to school. They said, what's the school thing you speak of? None of us went to school. They allowed her to go to school. She had to walk 3 miles by herself, 10 years old, in South Carolina, by herself. And that woman became a college graduate and has an advanced degree. And she realized from that point that the first start of equity was going to begin with education. And that became the #1 thing for her. The Bethune-Cookman University that you know about today, she started that back in 1927 with $1.50. Now, even for inflation, $1.50 still $1.50. And that is the school that we knew today. And from that moment, she knew that her purpose was to create equality for all of us in every field. Like you said, whether it was health, education, housing, everything. And she fought that till the day she died.
Yes, and so Sadiqa, in the House of Eve, there is a very important civil rights, human rights cause that you champion, and so the role of reproductive health, and we see that both Eleanor and Ruby have a different relationship with it. And an interesting quote that you included, well, a statistic, is that between 1945 and 1974, 1.7 million women in the U.S. lost children to forced adoption because abortion was illegal. Can you talk about your research into the maternity homes and the importance of access to reproductive health?
So once I discovered my grandmother's story, I thought I needed to know more. And I'm a big proponent of the library. Do we have any library heads in the room? Yes, right? So I was that kid that went to the library once a week when I was growing up. And so I still go to the library. And I found a book called Our Kind of People. I found a book called The Girls Who Went Away. And it was by a woman named Ann Fessler. And she talked about 100 different women who went into maternity homes and what their stories were. Because again, this is something that we know nothing about, right? And as I was reading their stories, I could see the likeness to things that my grandmother had experienced, but I thought she didn't have this option. Thank God, because I wouldn't be here, right? I wouldn't be able to tell the story. But what was life like for these girls in these maternity homes? And I found that the maternity homes were sort of like baby-making machines, mostly for white women, not necessarily for black women, because the white baby was the commodity. So during this time, if there were couples that wanted to have a baby, and this was before IVF, so they couldn't, go and get pregnant, they would get these babies from these adoption homes. And so these girls oftentimes will go in not knowing anything about having a baby, giving up their babies, and the babies would be taken for them. There's a scene in the story where there's a mother who has been breastfeeding her baby, and the women, mostly nuns, oftentimes would just come in, took the baby off her breast, and gave the baby away for adoption. And so they had no rights. And I thought it was really important when I learn about things like that happen in history. I almost feel like I need to write at it, right? I need to expose it so that we understand the privilege that we have today. And as I was writing the book, I was probably about 5 drafts in when Roe v. Wade was overturned. And I thought to myself, my goodness, we're going right back where we were. So stories like this are really important. I always feel like we need to know where we came from in order to know where we're going and what we need to do to make sure we're going in the right direction.
Yeah, and so speaking of knowing where we came from, with Hattie McDaniel, and we see the criticism that she experiences from the NAACP and within the black community for portraying the role of Mammy and other subsequent roles that she gets. Can you talk about why it was important for her to have that role and the path that she has paved for Hollywood since then?
One of the things that shocked me the most in writing this story was the treatment from the NAACP. They were well-meaning because they wanted us to have better representation. They wanted us to be more than servants and slaves on camera. But Hattie was saying to them, I would love to play Wonder Woman. Where do I go sign up for these roles? I'm playing what they allow me to play. And her infamous quote is, I'd rather play a maid for $700 than be a maid for $7. And the NAACP waged an all-out war. And in fact, once in 1942, they invited her to their national convention. She thought she was going to be honored, and instead they brought Lena Horne on stage and said, this is the image that we want portrayed, not Hattie McDaniel's Mammy. And so she had to sit in the audience where there are 10,000 people at this convention and be belittled because she chose to play roles that was the only thing she was allowed to play. So it's important to tell her story. I had an interview recently with a famous actress who said she is going through so much today that Hattie McDaniel went through back then. And she says that she's going through some of the same things from the black press and the black media that Hattie McDaniel went through then. So it is bittersweet to see the progress that we have made because there's so much that we still haven't made. And that's why it's important to tell her story and continue talking about it.
Absolutely. Victoria, speaking of progress, with Mary and all that she fought for civil and women's rights, we have come a long way, but in some ways we are stagnant is a nice way to put it. And so I want to know, what do you think Mary would say in terms of where we are today in 2024?
You know what's so interesting? I mentioned that she and Eleanor fought for the anti-lynching law. This was back in 1932, I think the first time they were pushing it. The anti-lynching law was just passed in 2022. I think Mary McLeod Bethune would say, "You have got to be kidding me. You have got to be kidding me." I think she would look at this political situation we're in now, and she would be like, "Look, you know what? Let me come out here and fix this for y'all." Because she just didn't play. And she said lives were at stake, and she was going to do everything she could to make life better for every black person in the country.
We could use her now. We need her to run for president.
We could. Man, I'd vote for her.
I wrote for her.
I think she has everyone's vote. So, Sadiqa, question for you. When we are in the House of Eve and we're experiencing life through Eleanor's lens, we see how she is navigating black elite society and the role that colorism plays when she's dating William. Can you talk about colorism and how it continues to manifest itself today?
So the House of Eve is told from two different perspectives. So Ruby is the character that was sort of based on my grandmother. She grew up in Philadelphia. She has a mother that wished she was never born, but she thinks that education is what's going to get her out of her situation. She falls in love with a very unlikely character, a Jewish boy, and she finds herself in trouble. And then on the other side, we see Eleanor. Eleanor comes from Ohio, and she was actually inspired a little bit by Toni Morrison in the sense that I had watched a documentary where Toni Morrison talked about going to Howard University from Ohio. And she said she didn't know that black folks separated themselves by color until she stepped foot on Howard University's campus in the 1950s. And I thought, wow, what if Eleanor was sort of like Toni Morrison in that respect, that she shows up at Howard and she's ready for this wonderful experience, but then colorism rears its nasty head. She goes to Howard, she falls in love with William Pride, who is one of the most eligible bachelors. He comes from a family of doctors. He comes from a family of privilege. And his mother is one of those mothers who she already has her daughter-in-law picked out. She picked her out in second grade, and she's ready for them to get married. And Eleanor is sort of throwing her plan off kilter. So she is a little browner than William's family, and so she doesn't quite fit. She also financially, socioeconomically, she does not fit, right? She does not fit the bill. And so she has all these strikes against her. And when I think about colorism, it sort of, to me, goes back to my previous novel, Yellow Wife. And my main character in Yellow Wife was the daughter of the master of the plantation, right? And so she was very fair-skinned, and you saw that the treatment was a little bit different. And that is sort of where it began for us, right? Separating the house enslaved people from the fields. And as we got into Reconstruction, these two communities sort of separated. And so there were families that had a little bit more privilege because of their skin color. And you see that play out in the House of Eve in the 1950s. And I think we still feel it, unfortunately, today, right? I think we see it on television, we see it in movies, We see it in music. We still see it today.
Yeah, and so that experience of being excluded is something that Hattie McDaniel experiences often throughout her career. And so I wanted to ask you about your research into her character when we see her trying to perform at different places across the U.S. and how she is just not accepted where she thinks that she should be. And just what did you find?
Yeah, first of all, one of the things that I found is y'all cannot trust the internet. We already know that, but I was mortified at the amount of erroneous information I found on the internet. When I first started out researching, they were talking everywhere. Wikipedia, every place, all these magazine articles talked about Hattie's husband, George Langford. And so as I dug deeper, I couldn't find out anything about this husband. Long story short, Hattie never had a husband named George Langford. And somebody wrote an article, somebody else repeated it, and I just kept finding those kind of erroneous things throughout. Lucky for me, Hattie loved writing letters to the editor, writing letters to her friends, so I was able to go and do a lot of research and get into her mindset and her psyche through her own individual letters. So I was really immersed in the research, so much so that I would call Victoria and say, guess what else Hattie did? And she'd say, can you stop researching and go write? Because I just got immersed in the research. But that is one of the things that I love about telling their stories, especially now I'm working on a book and I'm reading letters because, they had a tendency back in the day to write letters that I feel like I shouldn't be reading. I'm like, I don't think she wanted anybody to read. I told my daughters, burn everything. My sisters, burn everything because I don't want people to see this. But these letters they wrote, that's what we're reading, and those are one of the things that gets us through.
So, Victoria, in your novel, Mary's chapters she comes to life, and I think there's a scene where Mary is invited to an advisory council, and when she walks in, the first thing that they say to her is, I think you're in the wrong place. And her response is, my name is Mary McLeod Bethune, I belong here.
You know what's so funny about that scene? Every scene in the historical fiction that I write is always based on some truth, something from history that I know. That scene happened to me. And I don't want to take up too much time, but I went up to Vancouver because my movies were being filmed. A car usually comes to pick me up. It wasn't there, and then they told me to wait outside, and I saw this lumberjack coming toward me, and then he said, I'm here to pick you up, Victoria. I'm like, what are you doing? But he made me carry my own bags, and he kept looking at me and saying, you don't look like the type of people we normally pick up. And so now I'm pissed because you're only saying that because I'm black, and you're only making me carry my bag because I'm black. Nobody makes me, and he had me going, climbing steps and everything. Long story short, he was not my driver. He was someone else's driver. He drove college students. No wonder I didn't look like the people he normally picked up, because I'm about 50 years older than the people he picks up. And so we wanted to put that scene in the book, though, to show that racism has us on edge. We encounter so many things that sometimes even a good Samaritan will mistake what they were doing because it'll feel like racism to us because we've experienced so much racism. So I had Mary go in that room to those people and say, I belong here. And they were like, no, you don't. Your room is 222 downstairs. And she had to back up a little bit, but she did it with class. It was fun because I had to do the same thing.
No, and so my other question for you all, so in each of your novels, you are exploring Black womanhood, and there is something to be said about how each of your characters have experienced life, and during the time that they were alive, they were not given the recognition or the respect that they deserved, and it is something that we continue to see today. And so my question for you is, moving forward, how do we celebrate Black women and make sure that our names are in the papers when we're alive and that we're celebrated and loved the way that we should be?
So I want to celebrate these two black women sitting next to me right now because they literally paved the way for me. I would not be sitting here if it was not for Victoria Christopher Murray and Rashonda Tate. I used to watch them on Facebook. This was before Instagram was big. And they would go on their journeys together. I don't know if anybody, goes back that far, but they would be in the car together, and they were writing their books.
Before Oprah and Gail?
Yeah, before Oprah and Gail.
Oprah and Gail copied us.
Yes. And I was like, one day I want to be like that. Oh my gosh, one day I want to sell that many books. One day I want to be at that bookstore. Okay, what are they doing? Let me write it down. Let me write that down. And so I want to give them their flowers because they have paved the way for me and other black writers coming up. So let me say that. The other thing I think we can do is support each other, which we are all so supportive. The writing community of black writers is so supportive. We are always bigging each other up. We are always taking care of each other. And I think that as readers, you guys could do the same thing. Share. Like our thing, share our post, and keep that going. But I think in general, we do a pretty good job.
And I think that's the most important thing that we can do is supporting each other. But in order to keep the stories alive, we've got to tell these stories. I am so grateful to be in this historical space right now, telling the stories of these people that we've never heard of. I have a new novel coming out, Harlem Rhapsody, about the Harlem Renaissance and the one black woman who discovered every single Harlem Renaissance writer. And you've never heard her name. Probably because she had a torrid affair with W.E.B. Du Bois, and I think he began to erase it. If you want to read the first chapter, I have it here for you. And this will be the first place you could read it. We just have to continue telling the stories, but we need you. We need you because we'll never be able to continue doing it without you.
And since we're talking about women uplifting, one of the things that I want black women in general to really take away, Victoria and I get a lot of compliments, but we are a friendship that almost wasn't because we initially, when we started, I had someone tell me she didn't like me. And she kept inviting me to book events. And at one time someone said, I thought she didn't like you. I said, she doesn't, but I'm going to this book event. And long story short, it turns out that person just made it up. And imagine had I let someone try to tear down a friendship between black women. This person was a black male, and we don't know why he felt the need to do that. But so often we tend to listen to the negativity around us. And so there has been a support along the way. Another thing we got to do is to share our stories. Because when we started out, Victoria was considered the queen of Christian fiction. And I was writing, and I was with a different publisher, and she would tell me things. Usually we keep our information to ourselves. And she would say things like, well, your publisher didn't give you a credit card. And I said, no, what you mean you got a credit card? So I went back and I would ask for a credit card. And they gave me one because I didn't know to ask. But because you have people that share the stories, so we got to stop being stingy with our knowledge. And we really have to realize that a rising tide lifts all boats. And that's how we continue to uplift black women.
I know, Victoria, you shared. Do either of you have upcoming work that everyone can look forward to?
So I'm working on a novel, and it's funny because we're
so
sharing.
Good. Oh my God, her book is so good.
And we were backstage. I was like, I think I'm in over my head. So these two talked me off the ledge. They're like, you got this. But I'm working on a story right now it's entitled Beautiful Children. But don't get attached to the title, okay? Because my publisher will change it at a moment's notice, and I usually have to go with it. But right now it's called Beautiful Children, and it takes place after World War II, during the occupation of Germany, which this is my first time going into another country, so I'm kind of excited about that. They sent a lot of black GIs to Germany to help secure everything. Well, these black GIs get there, and there are no black women. So they start dating the white German women, and they have babies. And what happens to these babies? And so that's what my story is about.
And I am going back to Harlem. I have a book, and it's tentatively called Harlem Blues. They're actually going to change the name because she took Harlem Rhapsody.
I didn't take Harlem Rhapsody.
Well, yeah. But now they're like, nope, she has Harlem, so you got to come up with something else. But it is about Hazel Scott. And she is another unsung woman to me. Hazel Scott was one of the biggest jazz singers of all time, but we don't know about her because she was erased from history. She was Adam Clayton Powell's wife, second wife, and she spoke out against communism. They deemed her a communist, and she was not a communist, but they deemed her that and literally erased her from history. So her story is fascinating. Her marriage to Adam Clayton Powell is fascinating. And all of those letters that she wrote Adam Clayton Powell Jr., whoo, I am having a time reading them. But that is Harlem Blues. We don't know what the name is, but it comes out in 2026.
And my book comes out in 2026. We might go on tour together.
And
I would
my
love it.
book comes out very soon. It's February 4th, 2025. But you can get the first chapter today.
Okay, so thank you all for your time. Thank you for this amazing conversation.
You were amazing.
You're really good. Give it up for Morgan.